Welcome back yet again, folks. Aaron Keller here at Law and Crime, watching this cold case murder trial out of Georgia where defendant Frankie Gebhardt was recorded in a jail cell having a conversation with a neighboring inmate who was placed next to him. It's interesting that they mentioned that the defendant in this case, Frankie Gebhardt, was not there in custody. I'm curious about that. Was he just there thinking he was going to come in to answer questions? And how was this all set up? Of course, the legal issue there is custodial interrogations require Miranda warnings, and they seem to have gotten around that somehow. It may have been an interesting little operation here that they set up. We heard from prosecutors early on in this case that this ultimately would be a case where the defendant's words were used against him, that he said a lot about being involved in this alleged crime. So we're waiting with bated breath for this recording to be played in court. It might be a little bit tricky to listen to, but we will do our best. Ashley Willcott is a juvenile court judge and a trial attorney in the Atlanta, Georgia area. She's joining us here on Law and Crime as we wait for this recording to come out. Ashley, look, this is the big stuff. This is the defendant's own voice that the jurors will hear here.
Absolutely. And so we know in this case from the opening statement that there's some issues with evidence that the prosecution's already said, look, this happened 35 years ago. We don't have all the evidence. A lot of the techniques we can now use, we can't use. So a significant piece is the fact that they claim he boasts of killing this victim. So I'm hopeful these tapes will contain some of that information.
Yeah, what do you make of this recording of someone somehow in a jail facility or a police station and saying it's not a custodial interrogation? How does that work?
Right. So I'm wondering, and I don't know this, but I'm wondering if perhaps he was visiting someone there, or I don't know why he was there, but the implication by the judge, and it was interesting to me that the judge is the one to clarify and say, but wait, he wasn't there on charges related to this, right? He wasn't being held on these charges. So the implication is he was there for some reason that was his own free voluntary choice. He wasn't being interrogated. He wasn't being held. And therefore, anything that he says can be utilized as evidence against him.
Yeah, that's really curious because usually when you have these recordings pop up, then there's got to be a Miranda warning. And here, if they're saying it's not custodial, that he's just there hanging out, waiting to talk to somebody by his own free will, whatever it is, they don't have to warn him before this this interrogation begins. Really interesting.
It is interesting. The other thing I wonder, Aaron, is whether or not this is something that he was there on other charges. At some point, he was held on child molestation charges. So I don't know yet. Is this when he was perhaps there on those charges and there was an argument to be made that this crime had nothing to do with that crime and therefore Miranda doesn't apply? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know either. I'm curious to see how this wound up going through the pre-trial motions hearing practice. Presumably, the defense tried to keep it out or at least tried to argue that it was custodial. And look, this is the real crux of defense work. This is what it's all about for criminal defense attorneys, is whether or not some of these interrogations should have been done only after Miranda rights were read as a constitutional guarantee. Of course, if the police wind up getting an interrogation without the proper warnings, then it gets thrown out of court, Ashley. So, it seems like a minor point, but this is really where it's at for defense attorneys.
Absolutely, and I think it's really important for those watching to remember. Some say, well, if somebody admitted to doing such a horrific crime and killing this person in such a horrible way, then he should be responsible and he should be held accountable. But remember, it's that slippery slope. We have to make sure that the constitutional rights of everyone are protected, because if they aren't, yours may not be either. And so it has to meet all the criteria that it wasn't under duress, or it wasn't when he was being arrested and had a right to Miranda warning and he wasn't given that. So the whole constitutional argument is not only the crux of the defense. As a society, it's a very important piece that none of us need to forget.
Exactly, and it really gets in the weeds, but this is where it's really at for defense attorneys. So we saw just a nugget of it here in the trial. Usually this is all done before trial, and as you said, it's interesting that the judge saw fit to kind of bring it up here just to put it on the record. Ladies and gentlemen, remember, I already made a ruling about this in case some appeals court is trying to peek into things and look at that transcript and see exactly what happened. So, Ashley, hang on with us here. we want to remind everyone at home watching that this, again, is the Frankie Gebhardt case. It's a cold case murder investigation and trial out of Georgia. If you're not up to speed on the details, you will be after you watch this. So that got you up to speed on the Frankie Gebhardt case, and we want to let everyone know what's happening in court right now. We are not just taking an extended breather here on Law and Crime. The courtroom is having technology issues. They were just getting ready to play this really important recording of the defendant himself made in a jail facility of some sort. Apparently, it's really relevant. It may be the point where the defendant really sort of spills the beans and implicates himself in this in some fashion, because, again, prosecutors said in opening statements that it was the defendant's own words that started to tie him into this case. So what did they get out of him? We've got this hour and 20-minute or so long recording, and they're having issues playing it. So we're going to try to do the best we can to help them bide time a little bit here. So Ashley Willcott, juvenile court judge and trial attorney, is still here with us. Ashley, technology fails at the moment of critical need, I think is the way it goes, right?
Always, no matter how prepared you are for court and in court, something always comes up. So it's just the nature of the beast. Yeah,
and hopefully they're going to get this thing rolling pretty soon. But look, I mean, this might be the critical link, because you've got all these other little pieces here and there. You know, I mean, is the chain in the well, is that the chain that was used to kill this victim, or was it just the chain that was used to lower a bucket up and down some old well? You know, there's a real back and forth on some of these other things. You know, what of the chain? Is it relevant? Is it not? But it's the defendant's words that the state has promised us we're going to make the link in this case, so we want to hear them.
Absolutely. So one of the things the prosecution said was, number one, he boasted about it. Number two, what I find interesting is the prosecution indicated he never refers to the victim by his name. And so on this tape, I'm going to be curious, what details does he give to identify the defendant as the person that he allegedly murdered if he doesn't say Goggins?
You're right. I mean, the state said it was a lot of use of the N-word in this case. So look, we do have the recording playing in court now. Again, this is the death of Timothy Coggins, an African-American who prosecutors say was killed because he was trying to socialize with a white woman more than 30 years ago. We're going to go back to that courtroom now in Georgia to listen to that recording. Boy, this is an interesting jailhouse recording, folks. You can hear the noises of what sound like jailhouse doors opening and closing. I just commented here, it sounds almost like some of the background noise in the Shawshank Redemption movie. I mean, this is really gritty stuff. We're waiting for things to pick up in this recording. Ashley Willcott, juvenile court judge from Georgia, where this case is playing out. Ashley, it sounds to me like they're playing this thing without any editing. A lot of times when jurors hear these recordings, they're at least cut down a little bit, try to save time. It looks like they're going to play this thing right straight through. Yeah, for whatever reason, folks, we're not able to hear Ashley. I thought for a minute it was just on my end. We're going to try to straighten that out. But look, again, we're trying to get this recording playing in court, waiting for actual spoken words to appear on it, because we've been promised by prosecutors here that this is the critical stuff. This is the defendant himself, Frankie Gebhardt, basically saying that he was involved in the stabbing of Timothy Coggins, that he was involved in dragging Timothy Coggins behind a vehicle. Details about a case that prosecutors say that the local authorities knew, but which were never made public. And all of a sudden, this defendant was one of the people who started talking about them. So I think we might be able to go back to court if I can get a signal that that's where we're going to head next, if this recording is indeed going on. While we wait for that to all roll out, we're going to take a quick break here on Law and Crime, and we'll be back as soon as things pick up in that courtroom in Georgia. Teresa Coggins up on the witness stand in a trial that is occurring more than 30 years after her brother Timothy Coggins' death. Ashley Willcott is a juvenile court judge and a trial attorney in Georgia, where this trial is happening, and she joins us here on Law and Crime. Ashley, look, is this a case of justice delayed being justice denied, or is it a case where, because there's no statute of limitations for murder, that we can rest assured that justice delayed is not justice denied?
Well, I think in this case, the statute of limitations obviously makes a difference. They can still go forward with the case. But also, it sounds like to me, I expect the evidence to show that really the smoking gun in this case, so to speak, are the statements that this defendant has made about killing the alleged victim or this victim, allegedly killing this particular victim, I should say. So I think we're going to have to wait and see what that actual disclosure by him says to say, is that enough evidence to prove that he murdered this person?
Yeah, I mean, let's talk about the testimony here of this sister who's up on the stand, though. I mean, you've got this woman, Teresa Coggins, up there more than 30 years later trying to talk about her brother being killed in what's alleged to be a horrific killing some 30 years ago. I mean, talk about dragging up all sorts of bad memories in the past and just bringing them back to the surface again. One has to wonder, is it damaging? Is it therapeutic? Is it a little bit of both for witnesses to have to kind of like dip that far back into the horrible memories in the past and try to make sense of them these days?
Right. So, when I've been on the bench, I've seen both sides of it. And that is, first of all, obviously, yeah, it re-traumatizes and puts those family members back into those circumstances, which is not good for them. On the other hand, I often hear it provides closure for them and some sense of peace that they finally can feel like we may have closure and we may have someone responsible for this that's held accountable. So I think it can do both.
Yeah, well, we're going to continue our review of testimony from Teresa Coggins. Again, to let folks know what's happening live in that courtroom right now in the Frankie Gebhardt trial. We're listening to a recording being played in court, or at least we're trying to, because the recording is very hard to hear, and it's been nearly impossible for us to pick out anything relevant that's come up yet. So as jurors try to follow along on what I presume to be painstakingly prepared transcripts so that they can make sense of the words spoken in that recording, we're going to continue to listen to the testimony of Teresa Coggins, who was on the witness stand yesterday. The sister of victim Timothy Coggins up on the witness stand in the Frankie Gebhardt case out of Georgia. This is a cold case murder that happened more than 30 years ago. And after all that time, the family of Timothy Coggins up on the witness stand trying to make sense of some of the events from the not too distant past in some minds. So Ashley Willcott is a juvenile court judge and trial attorney there in Georgia. Ashley, this is a trial that's happening sort of midway between Macon and Atlanta. It's a rural county. It's kind of off the main interstate. That's the location we've got going on here. Let's talk about trial tactics for a second. The prosecutor is pretty harsh as to the way that the local sheriff's department handled this investigation more than 30 years ago. And it's certainly rare to see a case where the prosecutor is up there bashing the way the police investigation rolled out.
I agree with you, Aaron. It's rare, but keep in mind that was 30 years ago, 35 years ago. And I think the point of that is, I live in Atlanta, Georgia, and those familiar with the state know that, unfortunately, the Ku Klux Klan was marching and holding rallies throughout southern Georgia, specifically in these small rural communities. And as a result, the racist, hostile environment was pervasive in some of these communities. And so I think when she's bashing law enforcement from that many years ago, she's really saying, listen, they were a part of that horrible racist environment that committed horrible atrocities, and they need to be held accountable for that. So I think it's a little bit different than if she were standing there saying law enforcement today has done a bad job. Instead, she's saying, the Times in that time, they did a really terrible thing here. They didn't investigate well.
Yeah, I mean, trying to reach back through that veil of time and make sense of what's going on, I think it was something that the prosecutor played very well in opening statements. She was pretty harsh, but blunt, and it really sucked me into the case. That said, she didn't seem horribly sympathetic to the witness on the stand, whose brother was the victim in this attack. When you're up there asking questions of a witness who lost a family member and is becoming very emotional on the stand, it seems to me that you really have to kind of notch things down a little bit and then let the witness basically play out.
Well, I think that you do, but I also think sometimes as a trial attorney, when you're prepared and you have your questions and you've got 154 plus exhibits that you're going to have to plan to introduce, sometimes you can get caught up in that aspect of it and forget the human piece. It's not that it's forgotten. It's just you're so caught up in doing your job and crossing your T's and dotting your I's, you can sometimes forget to let the victim take it, or the witness. In this case, the other thing I want to say is I think the defense did a good job, Aaron, of saying, listen, they're going to ask you to rule on emotion because this is a horrible thing that happened, and they want you to listen to the emotional aspect of it, not focus on the who did it as much as the emotions of it. And this witness allows us to understand and feel the emotion. She paints a picture of the hostile, racist environment that she lived in Spalding County at that time.
Yeah, and there's a logical side to these cases as well that I oftentimes spend a lot more time talking about because I don't like to be sitting in a position of schooling people about how they should feel about something. And sometimes I face criticism for it. But look, you know, the evidence is what should be convicting people. And even if we look and see or think that something really, really evil happened here, the question is, did this particular defendant do it? And trying to make the link between this defendant and a crime based on this stuff that was thrown in the bottom of some old abandoned well without any clear sense that it's really the stuff or it was just thrown there. That's not logical. You know, I mean, a chain in the bottom of the well, well, I mean, heck, I stumble across wells when I'm out hiking here in the rural Northeast, and who knows what's in the bottom of them? Does it necessarily mean that the person who lived on that property years ago was using those items as part of a crime? No. It just means there's a chain laying in the bottom of a well.
Right, and we don't know. We do know that he doesn't name the victim by name and saying, I killed this person. So we don't have that type of confession to the best of my information. And so I really do wonder, are they going to be able to put the pieces together, especially when the prosecution's already admitted, look, there's about half of this evidence that's missing that we don't have anymore.
Yeah, you know, and one has to wonder why. I mean, was it just thrown away? Was it something more nefarious? Was it because someone didn't want that evidence to be out there? Given the racial undertones of this case, there are a lot of what ifs, and the defense was pretty clear that should hurt the state's case. That's the logical side of the argument here, and that's what the court of law is all about. But just to let everyone know what's happening in this case right now live, they're playing a recording of the defendant himself, Frankie Gebhardt, when he was in a jail facility, and the judge said he was not in custody. So what exactly he was doing there is a little bit unknown to me. I didn't have access to the judge's file to see exactly how this recording was made, but certainly an interesting circumstance. But bottom line, this recording is not intelligible the way it's being played. Jurors have copies of a transcript to try to help them pick the words out of it. These recordings get played over a sound system in the court of law, and then we try to pick it up off the sound system, and that degrades the quality of it even further from what it already is. And from what we understand, the spoken words in this recording are really spaced out. There will be minutes upon minutes upon minutes of dead space in this recording, and it's supposed to last an hour and 20 minutes. So we're trying to get some details from it to see exactly what was said by the defendant himself here, who the state said is implicated by his own words. This could be the most critical evidence in this case, but we are just not sitting in a position where we can understand any of it. We're trying our best to get it all straightened out for you folks. In the meantime, we're going to take a quick break. We'll be back with more about the Timothy Coggins murder case, the cold case from Georgia, when we come back. Testimony from one of the witnesses who said, look, the defendant, Frankie Gebhardt, in this cold case murder trial from Georgia, told me that he was involved in killing someone. So this might be the big piece of evidence that prosecutors were pointing to. He's one of several witnesses who testified to this. Ashley Willcott, juvenile court judge and trial attorney in Georgia. You're in the Atlanta area. Look, these are the links that prosecutors are telling jurors to hang their hats on. I think the defense did a reasonable job of cross-examining this guy and saying, hey, look, aren't you kind of a part of some misdeeds yourself over the years? And he explored it in a non-threatening but pointed way, it seemed.
He sure did, and I love the asking about his tattoos, right? And what they said.
I'm like, the defense attorney knows what's tattooed on this guy. I mean, that's a new one.
Right. So he is trying to discredit this witness and say to the jury, you can't find him credible. Look, he's doing these same kinds of crimes himself. He's, is this Nazi emblem. He hates blacks just as much as this alleged defendant does. So, that's what he's trying to do with that. And the defense has a very good demeanor, I think.
Yeah, I think the openings were a little bit softer than they could have been, but I think the way he asks questions kind of makes the witness squirm a little bit and really kind of makes the witness think about how to answer things. They're ninja attack questions, I guess I could say. So, look, Ashley, you're going to want to listen to this because we're going to bring you back into that courtroom now live. It's taken a long time for this recording to sort of pick up to speed. Again, this is a recording of the defendant himself. He was recorded in a jail, but apparently he wasn't in custody. This might be critical because these are the defendant's own words. So we're going to go into court live and try to pick up on what he's saying. It is very, very hard to hear this play out in court, folks. This is the Timothy Coggins cold case murder trial from Georgia. The accusation is the defendant, Frankie Gebhardt, killed Timothy Coggins, an African-American man, because Coggins was interested, perhaps romantically, in a Caucasian woman. So those are the accusations. Frankie Gebhardt allegedly acted with a co-defendant named Bill Moore, who the prosecutor said would face trial some other time. This trial is only for Frankie Gebhardt, and we're listening in court right now to a jailhouse recording that somehow captured Frankie Gebhardt, the defendant, even though the judge said he wasn't in custody when this recording was made. And what you heard, at least in the beginning there, when we dipped back into court, was an investigator talking to the informant who was wearing the wire about specific questions that that investigator wanted posed to the defendant. And then you heard the steps and you heard that informant walk back to wherever the defendant himself was located. And then the conversation ensued, but it's really tough to hear it. So Ashley Willcott is still on the line with us from Georgia. She's in Atlanta. This is tough to hear, Ashley, and I wish I knew what was being said, but presumably it's similar to some of these other witnesses who said, oh yeah, the defendant talked about killing, for not to use the exact word that he is alleged to have used, but killing an African-American man. And the state is trying to link this crime to the defendant basically through the words of all of these other witnesses.
Techniques. Here's where it is in this case. The prosecution, because that's so hard to hear on the audio tape that they're listening to, they have that transcript for the jury. And don't you wish we had that? Because then we could really see what's actually being, we can't really hear it. But it's smart because not only are they getting to read the words and know what he said, they're hearing his voice as the defendant's voice. So it's a very good strategy in terms of the trial techniques being utilized by the prosecution.
I agree, because look, it's not a video recording. Wouldn't that have been something? But it's an audio recording, and you can pick up tone of voice in an audio recording. Is the defendant acting nonchalant? Does he not seem to care about this crime, which he allegedly spoke of being a part of? What is the tone in his voice? Is it unremorseful? Is it believable, or is he just bragging to try to make himself look like a big shot in a location where people are known behind bars, in other words, to exaggerate what sort of bad acts they've been involved with?
Right, that's exactly right. And that's why, the prosecution's playing it well in terms of putting everything out there in a way that the jury can understand all of the evidence as much as possible. I can't wait, Aaron, to learn about what that recording actually says, because I can't hear it either. But it's going to be a real key to whether or not he says enough to basically incriminate himself.
Yes, and the big question is this enough? Because really the only key evidence that the prosecution has to tie this defendant to the alleged crime are the defendant's own words. All the other evidence was either, lost or inconclusive. Don't you wish we had this alleged gray hair, which was on the victim's clothing when the victim was killed? It's said to be a Caucasian hair. If we had that, it might have DNA. Of course, could it lead to the killer, or is it just, a random person's hair that got stuck on the victim's clothing some other time? We don't really know, but there are so many things in this case that we just wish we had, and we don't have them.
That's right. And as one of the witnesses testified, the investigative techniques that exist today that didn't exist 30 years ago are just so drastic and extreme that it's a completely different type of scientific ability now that we have.
I want to ask one more question before we dip back into some review of testimony here. Ashley, let's talk about hearsay and why all of this comes in. Of course, if it's a statement out of court, the general rule is it doesn't come in, but all of these witnesses are talking, well, he said this, and it still comes into court, and of course, that's because there's an exception.
Right, and the party's own admission. So in this case, I think the argument was made that it's an admission by a party, the party being the defendant, to the crime, and so it gets to come in as an exception to hearsay.
It is theoretically hearsay, but it gets to come in because there's this lengthy list of, well, here's what it is, but by the way, this all can come in even though it is. So just to point that out legally, that's how it comes in. Comes in a lot of cases. So bottom line, we are hearing it here, and I really wish we had that transcript. But while we wait to see exactly what comes out in court, we're going to listen to some of the previous testimony from these other witnesses who allegedly are saying the same thing that this recording is, and that is that the defendant himself admitted to being a party to the murder of not Timothy Coggins by name, but an N-word. That's the accusation, that is what is said. One of the other witnesses who went there in court and explained this is Robert Smith. He was a friend of the defendant's back in the 1980s when this crime is alleged to have occurred at this defendant's hands. So let's listen to some of his testimony from earlier in the case. Wow, this is some compelling testimony in the Timothy Coggins cold murder case from Georgia. Ashley Willcott is a juvenile judge in Georgia and a trial attorney. Ashley, look, this witness, if this is to be believed, this is some pretty critical stuff. You've got that N-word flying around in open court. You've got accusations of flat-out racism. They're all being aimed at the defendant, and this witness is saying this defendant basically admitted to playing a role in the murder of Timothy Coggins more than 30 years ago.
Right, and I think the most telling testimony when he testified, and I think I wrote it down correctly, that was the last time that the defendant made the comment. That was the last time we saw that little N-word after he'd been with a white girl. And so it's some really damning statements.
Yeah, I mean, does it draw as direct a link as prosecutors are insinuating it does, you think, or does it draw a strong link, not a conclusive link?
If I were the defense, I would argue it's absolutely not a conclusive link, because not once have we heard the defendant identify the man by name. And so regrettably, it could be referring to any African-American man. Right now, we haven't heard anything to say it's this defendant specifically killed this person.
And you know, does it matter necessarily? I mean, I'm sure that you would say that it does, but I mean, is there doubt in that community among these people as to whom the defendant was referring?
I think that's a really good question, Aaron, and I think that hopefully is going to be one of the questions that the prosecution asks of that witness, because that's what we need the witness to tell the jury. Is there any doubt in that witness's mind this is the person, is Coggins the person that was meant when he said that? I don't know. Hopefully they'll ask that question.
And you know, it's like I go back to this, and we oftentimes cover trials. You know, we cover trials in big cities, we cover trials in small rural areas. This one certainly is the latter. And look, it's not necessarily unfair for an identification to not involve someone by name if it's, at least if it's clear on the record that everybody knew who that person was referring to.
That's right. And if it was specific enough, perhaps the identifier of the one that was with the white woman, that may be enough, because remember at one point there's some information that one of his friends said to Coggins, do not hang out with a white woman in this county, in this area. If you're going to do that, go to Atlanta because it's not safe. So, you know, maybe there's argument to be made by defining or describing as the one with the white woman, everybody that he hung out with or talked to knew, yeah, that's who he's referring to. He's talking about that Coggins. That's who he killed.
Yeah, these are really good questions. I hope the prosecutor made that link very, very clear as this questioning rolled along. We're going to continue to review it as jurors continue to listen to what's turned out to be a very difficult to understand recording taken into jail of the defendant in this case speaking with a criminal informant and allegedly dropping more of these hints that he was involved in the death of Timothy Coggins more than 30 years ago. That recording is so hard to hear that we're not carrying it for you live. As soon as we pick up more details from it, we're going to try to pass them along. In the meantime, let's continue on with this previous testimony. More testimony there from Robert Smith, a friend of defendant Frankie Gebhardt. Frankie Gebhardt is on trial accused of a racially motivated murder more than 30 years ago in rural Georgia. The victim, Timothy Coggins, died after prosecutors say he was stabbed and dragged behind a vehicle. Ashley Willcott is an attorney in Atlanta, Georgia, and a juvenile court judge. She's helping us break down this testimony. Ashley, we were talking before about whether or not the identification that was allegedly made by the defendant in speaking with this witness was clear. And I didn't quite hear it there, but I did hear an important objection as to speculation. And part of me wonders, the closer prosecutors try to get to saying, hey, look, did you take this to mean that he killed this individual? There would have popped up an objection, speculation. He doesn't know for sure.
Right. But I haven't yet heard them ask the specific question. Did you know if it, who the person was that he was referring to? Because he could answer that yes or no. Now, the following question might draw an objection, but you could at least get that groundwork laid.
Yeah, part of me wonders, do prosecutors not want to ask that question in case there was some kind of ambiguity there? Is it one of those things, because, sometimes the way you have to do this is you sort of ask question, and they all point to a conclusion, but you don't ask about the conclusion, okay? You just argue the conclusion in a closing argument. Say, look, everybody knew who he was talking about, even though there's no testimony to directly indicate that. Could that be the tactic here?
Sure, absolutely, because you always have to be careful. If you're going to ask a question you do not know the answer to, you may not want that answer. And so if they don't know what he's going to say, it's a real risk to ask that question. Yeah,
part of me really wonders if that's the way it was going and rolling along here. Listen, we're going to take a pause from this as jurors in the Timothy Coggins cold case in Georgia continue to listen to this jailhouse recording that is very inaudible. They're struggling through it with the aid of a prepared transcript that we unfortunately do not have here on the Law and Crime Network, as much as we wish that we had it. So we're going to take a quick pause from our review of this critical testimony and a quick pause while jurors continue to listen to that very difficult to hear recording to get you caught up to speed on the top crime stories of the day. End of the day now in the Timothy Coggins cold case murder trial in rural Georgia, about midway between Macon and Atlanta, off the highway. That's the location for this rural trial. The accusation that the defendant, Frankie Gebhardt, committed a racially motivated murder of an African-American man named Timothy Coggins more than 30 years ago. And we just heard some of the snips of this long recording that had been played for jurors, and we just couldn't pick up much of it. It was very hard to hear. A lot of ambient noise, as oftentimes jailhouse recordings tend to have. They're not recorded with professional equipment. They're recorded with clandestine equipment. The further the microphone is away from the mouths of the people speaking, the harder it is to hear. So, bottom line, this really did paint a bigger picture of what was going on in this case. Ashley Willcott is still on the line with me. She's an attorney in Atlanta and a juvenile court judge. So, Ashley, look, you heard the defendant there in one of the exchanges that was read onto the record just to make it clear. Okay, they were repeating what was in the recording. What was said there is basically, well, look, the state has to prove it. Words aren't worth a crap, in other words. So is this the defendant trying to insinuate he did it, but say that the state doesn't have enough to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt? Or is the defendant just playing mind games with whoever the informant was?
Well, I think the defendant is trying to say, you know what, who cares what I say? Who cares what comes out of my mouth? You don't have the evidence to prove it. It happened 30 years ago. Too bad, too sad. You're not going to convict me. I think it's that simple in terms of what he's doing.
Yeah, and, we also heard one of the exchanges there where the defendant didn't deny throwing these items into the well. That doesn't necessarily mean he admitted to doing it.
Right. Right, and don't keep in mind that the testimony was that not only were these items in the well, it was like 20 years of trash and stuff and gunk that had been thrown down there, and you already had testimony from the GBI that said, no, I cannot say that this chain is the one that was used on the defendant to murder him, kill him, drag him behind a truck. So you have to make the connection. They haven't been able to make that.
Yeah, it could all add up to reasonable doubt here for jurors. It could mean that this is the best the state can do in this case. But we had some of the previous witnesses on the stand in this case. One of them, Christopher Vaughn, he knew the defendant, this defendant, and the co-defendant, Bill Moore, who is yet to be tried, but who faces charges in this case. Let's listen to some of how he characterized these conversations that he had back and forth with Frankie Gebhardt, the defendant, and himself. And there you have the link, folks. The will supposedly contained the clothes and the murder weapon. The witness on the stand there, if we're to believe him, says that the defendant basically bragged about killing Timothy Coggins more than 30 years ago. Ashley Willcott, one or two more questions here before we wrap up for the day. This witness is making the link a lot more strongly than some of the other ones.
Absolutely. The fact that he can now say that's where he was told that the weapon and the clothes were makes a link that we hadn't heard up until this point. Yeah, so, you know, you've got an alleged link here. You've got this guy saying there's clothes in the well. Well, they search the well and they find clothes. The tests don't really prove anything because they were degraded and whatnot. But a lot of times jurors turn around and say, well, we've got a story and we're not sure if it's true. But then when the story leads to the discovery of an item, jurors turn around and say, well, that story makes sense. How else would that witness know that these clothes are in the well? The witness wasn't digging around in the well. And ergo, we find the clothes. And they look at, and I didn't mean to interrupt you, and I apologize, but they look at all the individual facts and they have to consider, does each fact add up and support the other facts that have been introduced into evidence to make sense, to really prove beyond that reasonable doubt that, yes, this defendant killed this particular man. Yeah, boy, it seems like this state's getting a stronger and stronger case, but there are still some doubts. This is a really interesting case to cover. Ashley Willcott, juvenile court judge and trial attorney in the Atlanta, Georgia area. Always appreciate your insight, and especially in a trial that's happening within an hour or two of where you live. Absolutely. Thank you, Aaron, for having me. Okay, we'll see you next time. And just to let folks know what's happening in the other case that we're covering here on the Law and Crime Network, that's the murder of a U.S. Marine corporal in the Lexington, Kentucky area. The defense wrapped up its case and rested. The prosecution is going to call rebuttal witnesses. If you'd like to watch that, you can always go to the raw feeds that come in to us on lawandcrime.com. That is where that trial will be continuing as long as it's in session. We're going to wrap up the broadcast day, though, with a reminder that we're on the air live from 9 a.m. until 5 p.m. here on Law and Crime. I will see you first thing tomorrow morning. For now, this is Aaron Keller. For all of us here at Law and Crime, have a good night.